The great city of Caldera stood under a pale blue sky, its shining towers reaching up like fingers of glass, stretching toward the stars. It was a city of power and secrets, a place where the fate of an entire alien species was decided. Queen Illyra, the ruler of the Calderan people, stood on the balcony of her palace, looking out over the vast landscape. The horizon seemed endless, but within her heart, she felt a deep emptiness. Her people were dying. The Calderans, once a thriving civilization, had reached a point where their population could no longer reproduce. Years of genetic decline and the loss of a sacred ritual had left their species on the brink of extinction. Illyra's father, the emperor, had tried everything: scientific experiments, desperate alliances, and even seeking help from other alien species, but nothing had worked. Her people were on the verge of extinction, and she was their last hope. But there was one solution, a solution that both shocked and horrified the queen. It was said that only by mating with a human male could the Calderans restore their fertility. The ancient prophecies spoke of this, but the idea was so controversial that even Illyra had dismissed it for years. Her people, proud and powerful, had always seen themselves as superior to the humans, creatures from a distant planet far removed from the glory of Caldera. Yet, desperation had led the queen to reconsider. Illyra stood there, lost in thought, when her advisor, Dr. Vallon, entered the room. He was a tall, stoic man, his face marked by years of service to the royal family. His expression was serious, and Illyra knew he was about to bring her news she didn't want to hear. "Your Majesty," Vallon said, bowing slightly, "the human envoy has arrived. They are waiting for you in the royal hall." The queen nodded. "Send them in." As Vallon left, Illyra turned her gaze back to the horizon. Could it be true? Could a human male truly be the answer to saving her people? Her mind raced with questions. It wasn't just the physical act that troubled her. It was the political consequences. To mate with a human was a betrayal of her heritage, of everything her people had believed in. But what other choice did she have? A moment later, the doors to the royal hall opened, and in walked the human representative, a tall man with a strong build and dark, piercing eyes. He looked out of place in the palace, his clothes mismatched with the royal surroundings. Illyra couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort, but she kept her composure. "Welcome to Caldera," she said, her voice steady but cold. "I assume you know why you're here." The human bowed slightly, his expression respectful but curious. "Your Majesty, I know the rumors, and I know the situation your people face. I'm here to help, if you'll allow me." Illyra's heart raced. She had no time for pleasantries. "You know what's required of you, don't you? You must mate with me if there is any hope for my people." The human's face softened, and for the first time, Illyra saw a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "I do," he said quietly, "but I need to know something first. Why me? Why a human?" The queen's gaze hardened. "Because the Calderans cannot reproduce without human genetics. Your species carries the key to saving us all. Do not ask questions about why or how. Time is running out." The human nodded, as if accepting the weight of her words. But Illyra could see the doubt in his eyes. He had no idea what he was getting into. In that moment, Illyra realized that her destiny had changed forever. She was no longer just a queen. She was the last hope for her people. But the path she was about to take would change the course of her life, and the life of the human male who had unknowingly become part of the prophecy. And there was no turning back. The royal hall was quiet as Illyra and the human stood facing each other. The tension between them was thick, filled with the unspoken weight of their situation. Illyra tried to steady her breath. She had always been in control, whether it was as a queen or in her personal life. But today, everything felt different. The human, Jack, as he had introduced himself, was a man of average height, with dark brown hair and a strong jawline. His eyes were deep and searching, as if trying to understand a mystery that was beyond him. His attire, a simple but rugged suit, contrasted sharply with the luxurious robes and gleaming architecture of the Calderon Palace. Yet there was something undeniably magnetic about him. Elira looked at him closely, her mind racing. Why me? She wondered. Why did the prophecy choose this human to save my people? She had spent years learning about the ancient legends, yet nothing had prepared her for the reality of what she now faced. She could not deny the raw, undeniable power in his gaze, but that did not mean she could accept what was being asked of her. Jack stood still, clearly aware of the Queen's scrutiny. He knew why he had been called here. He had heard the whispers of the prophecy. A human male. The last hope for a dying species. He had prepared himself for this moment, but now that he was standing here, facing the Queen, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. You've heard the story, Elira said, breaking the silence. You know what must be done. Jack nodded, his expression solemn. Yes, Your Majesty. I understand the stakes, but I have to ask, is there no other way? No other solution? Elira felt a pang of sadness at his question. She knew the answer. She had searched for alternatives, had tried every possible option, but nothing had worked. The ancient text that foretold this union was clear. Only a human could restore the fertility of her people. Yet, even as the words formed in her mind, she could not bring herself to say them aloud. I wish there was, Elira replied softly, her voice tinged with regret. But there isn't. Jack stood in silence, his gaze never leaving hers. Elira could feel his uncertainty, his hesitance. He didn't know what to expect. And honestly, neither did she. She was the Queen, the ruler of a dying civilization. And yet here she was, asking a stranger to do the unthinkable. As the silence stretched, Jack finally spoke again. What happens after? After we do what is required. Elira met his gaze with a new level of seriousness. After you return to your people, you are not expected to stay here. What happens between us will remain private. Your world will continue, and mine will have a chance to live on. Jack seemed to relax slightly, but his next words were heavy. And what about you, Queen Elira? Will you be all right with this? Is this the only way? Elira's heart skipped a beat at the question. The truth was, she wasn't sure. She had never expected her life to take this path. But if it meant saving her people, she would do it. She had to. I must do what is necessary, Elira said, her voice unwavering. My people depend on it. And so, do I. Jack nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He could feel the responsibility weighing on his shoulders now. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about an entire species. He had been thrust into this story, and there was no turning back. As the moment stretched between them, the realization settled in that their fates were now linked forever. Whether they liked it or not, their paths had crossed for a reason. And soon, they would both have to face the consequences of the decision they were about to make. Jack took a deep breath and stepped forward. Let's do what must be done. Elira's heart pounded in her chest. She had always carried the heavy burden of leadership, but now it was different. She had to trust a stranger, an alien, a human, who, despite the differences between their worlds, was about to become her equal in a way she had never imagined. There was no going back. The palace was bathed in soft, golden light as the sun set over the desert outside. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Elira stood before the great ceremonial hall, preparing herself for the task ahead. Her heart beat faster with every passing second. This moment, this choice, would change everything for her people and for herself. The room was silent, save for the soft rustling of the ceremonial robes Elira wore. They were unlike any other garments she had worn before, woven with delicate threads that glowed faintly, matching the ancient markings that adorned her skin. They were symbols of her people's heritage, a heritage that was now at risk of being lost forever. The ritual was about to begin, and the only hope for her species lay in the hands of a human male, one she had barely known until now. Jack stood across the room, his posture tense but steady. He, too, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been prepared for many things, but this was something he never thought he would face. The future of an entire species rested on what was about to unfold. His gaze met Elira's, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to vanish. They were no longer strangers. In that brief moment, they were united by a shared purpose. "Are you ready?" Elira's voice was quiet but filled with determination. Jack nodded slowly, his heart pounding. "I'm ready," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure he was. The idea of mating with a queen from another world, especially one so powerful, was beyond anything he had imagined. But the alternative was unthinkable. He couldn't let an entire species disappear just because of some ancient tradition. Elira took a step forward, her movements graceful and purposeful. "This is the final act," she said. "Once we begin, there is no turning back." Jack watched as she approached, her presence commanding. The glow of the ceremonial robes illuminated her face, and for a moment, she looked like something out of a dream. Otherworldly, powerful, and yet fragile all at once. She was a queen, but more than that, she was a leader who had taken on a responsibility no one could have prepared her for. She stopped just in front of him, their faces inches apart. Jack could feel the heat of her skin, the warmth of the energy she radiated. He saw the seriousness in her eyes, the fear and the hope. "I never imagined my life would come to this," Elira said softly, almost to herself. Jack reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently placed it on her shoulder. "I'm not sure I imagined it either," he admitted with a small, reassuring smile. "But I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes." Elira gave a small nod, and for the first time, she allowed herself to relax, just a little. She trusted him, and she had to. There was no room for doubt now. The ceremony began with a deep, resonating hum that filled the room. Ancient Calderan symbols, etched into the walls, glowed brightly, casting an eerie but beautiful light. The air seemed to thicken, as if the universe itself held its breath. As they stood together, their hands clasped, the Queen's advisors and the royal court gathered in silence, watching from the shadows. The tension in the room was palpable. Jack could feel their eyes on him, their judgment. But all he could focus on was Elira. She was the reason he was here, and she was the reason he would push through the uncertainties. He had to. Elira's hands glowed with a faint blue light as she chanted softly in her native tongue. Jack had no idea what she was saying, but he could feel the energy in the room shifting with every word. Slowly, they both closed their eyes, and the room seemed to close in on them, the air heavy with the power of the ritual. In that moment, Jack knew that this was no ordinary act. It was a union that transcended worlds, species, and cultures. This was about survival, and nothing would stop them now. As the ceremony continued, the world outside seemed to disappear, and for the first time, Jack could sense that they were more than just two people. They were part of something greater, something ancient, something destined. The ceremony room was now alive with a strange ethereal energy, the light shifting with every step they took. Elira and Jack stood together, facing the unknown. The air around them felt charged, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something monumental to occur. It was the most surreal moment of Jack's life, a moment where the entire fate of a species rested on his shoulders. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He had never imagined his life would lead him here, standing with an alien queen whose people's survival depended on him. He had seen many things in his time as a soldier: danger, conflict, and the weight of tough decisions. But this was something entirely different. This was a moment of profound responsibility, one that stretched beyond anything he had ever known. Elira's gaze never left him. She seemed calm on the outside, but Jack could sense the storm brewing within her. Her species had been on the brink of extinction for so long, and now the weight of their future rested in this single act. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the uncertainty hidden beneath her regal composure. I'm not sure I understand everything about this, Jack said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. He was speaking more to himself than to her, but Elira heard him nonetheless. You don't need to, she replied, her voice gentle. You don't need to understand everything. All you need to do is trust that this is the only way forward. Jack met her eyes, searching for any sign of doubt, but found none. She was resolute in her belief that this act would save her people, and in that moment, Jack realized that his doubts didn't matter. The universe had brought them together for a reason, and there was no turning back now. Elira raised her hand, and the symbols on her skin glowed brighter, pulsing with energy. The light in the room intensified, filling the space with a warm, comforting glow. Jack felt it too, the power of the ritual, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing second. This is the moment, Elira said softly. Her voice had a strange, otherworldly quality to it, almost as if she were speaking both to him and to the universe itself. Once we begin, we are linked forever. Our destinies will be intertwined. Jack nodded, swallowing hard. The weight of her words hung in the air, and yet he felt something else, something more powerful than fear or uncertainty. He felt the pull of the connection between them, a bond forming that was stronger than he could have ever imagined. He reached out, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. Elira's eyes flickered with something like surprise, but it was quickly replaced with a quiet understanding. There was no need for words anymore. Their shared purpose had spoken louder than anything they could say. The hum of the energy grew louder, almost deafening now, as their hearts beat in unison. Elira closed her eyes, her face softening as she allowed herself to be vulnerable in a way she hadn't been for so long. She had always carried the burden of leadership, of responsibility for her people. But now, she was allowing herself to trust Jack completely. The moment stretched, the intensity of the energy swirling around them. Jack's thoughts cleared, and all that mattered was the bond they were about to form. This was no longer about species or politics or anything else. It was about them, two individuals brought together by fate and necessity. And then, without another word, they began. The energy around them exploded in a burst of light, surrounding them in a cocoon of warmth and power. Jack could feel the rush of energy coursing through him, through both of them. It was as if the universe itself had aligned to make this moment happen. Time seemed to slow as their connection deepened, and Jack realized, in that moment, that he had never felt more alive. Elira opened her eyes, looking at him with an intensity that was both beautiful and terrifying. She was no longer just a queen, no longer just the last hope of her people. She was something more, something he couldn't fully understand yet, but he knew one thing for sure: he would stand by her, no matter what came next. And as their bond was sealed, Jack knew that this moment would forever change both of their worlds. The energy in the room slowly settled, leaving a strange, comforting silence in its wake. Jack and Elira stood facing each other, their hands still touching, their breath slow and steady. The world around them seemed to have disappeared, leaving only the two of them, connected by an invisible thread. It was as if time itself had paused to witness this moment, and in that stillness, Jack could feel the weight of everything that had just transpired. He glanced at Elira, seeing her in a new light. She was still the same powerful queen, but there was something different about her now. Her eyes, once full of responsibility and leadership, now held a softness he hadn't seen before. She had allowed herself to trust him, to believe in what they had just done. And in that trust, Jack felt a sense of pride and purpose that he had never felt before. Elira slowly pulled her hands away from his, though the connection between them lingered. Her gaze shifted, and Jack could see the conflict in her eyes. She had carried the weight of her people's survival for so long, and now that it was done, the reality of it all began to settle in. Is it done?" Jack asked, his voice breaking the silence. Elira nodded, but her expression was unreadable. "Yes," she said softly. "It is done." Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him, but it was mixed with uncertainty. He had never imagined that his life would lead him to this point, and now that it was over, he couldn't help but wonder what came next. What would happen to them both after this moment? The room was still, but the air felt different, charged with a quiet intensity. The power of their bond, created by their shared act, was undeniable. Jack could feel it pulsing between them, a constant reminder that they were now linked in a way no one else could ever understand. Elira took a deep breath and turned away from him. She walked to the center of the room, where the ancient symbols on the floor were still glowing faintly. Her back was straight, her posture regal, but there was something vulnerable about her that Jack hadn't noticed before. For the first time, he saw her not as a queen, but as a person, a woman who had carried the future of her people on her shoulders. "Elira, are you okay?" Jack asked softly, his voice filled with concern. He had never seen her look so distant, so lost in thought. She turned back to him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know," she admitted. "This changes everything. I've saved my people, but at what cost?" Jack took a step closer, his hand reaching out toward her. "I don't have all the answers, but I'm here for you. We've done something incredible today. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Elira's expression softened at his words, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. She had never allowed herself to be vulnerable before, but in this moment, she realized that it was okay to lean on someone else, to trust someone outside of her people, outside of her responsibilities. The silence that followed was filled with understanding. No words were needed. They had both given something of themselves, Jack by offering his help, and Elira by opening her heart to him. Together, they had sealed their fates, and there was no going back. But in that moment, Jack knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. What they had done was important, but it was only one chapter in the larger story of what lay ahead for them both. As the glow of the symbols on the floor began to fade, Jack and Elira stood together in the quiet, a new bond forged between them, one that would shape the future of her people and their own lives in ways neither could yet understand, but they would face it together, no matter what challenges the universe had in store. The days following the ceremony passed in a blur for both Elira and Jack. The palace, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now felt lighter, though an undercurrent of change lingered in the air. Elira had returned to her duties as queen, but there was a shift in how she viewed the future. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but the weight of what had transpired still weighed heavily on her. Jack, too, was trying to adjust. Though he had played a crucial role in saving an entire species, he found himself questioning what his place was now. His time on the Calderan homeworld had been brief, but it felt like he had already experienced more than he ever expected in his lifetime. He had helped the queen, and he had earned her trust, but now he faced an unfamiliar challenge. What would come next for him? One afternoon, as Jack wandered the palace grounds, his mind was still full of questions. He had been welcomed as a hero, but he knew he didn't quite fit in here. The Calderans were a proud and ancient species, and Jack was just a human. His thoughts were interrupted when a familiar voice called out to him. "Jack, you've been avoiding me," Elira said, stepping into his path. She looked different today. Her usual regal presence was softened by something more vulnerable, something that spoke of the bond they had formed during the ritual. "I haven't been avoiding you," Jack replied with a small smile. "Just thinking." Elira gave him a soft look. "I can understand that. I've been thinking too. About everything. About what happens now." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Yeah, me too. It's hard to know where to go from here, isn't it?" "It is," Elira agreed. "But I think we both know that we've changed things. For better or worse, we've created a new path for our people. And for us." There was a long pause before Jack spoke again. "Do you ever think about what you really want, Elira? For yourself?" Her eyes softened, and she took a step closer to him. "I've spent so much of my life thinking about the needs of my people, their survival, The future. But I've never really thought about what I want for myself. Not until now. Jack felt a wave of compassion for her. It wasn't just the queen he had gotten to know. It was a person, a woman who had sacrificed so much for her people. And now, she was trying to find her way in a world that had changed, just like he was. I think we both deserve a chance to find out what we want, Jack said gently. You've done everything for your people. Maybe now it's time for you to do something for yourself. Elira smiled faintly, her expression filled with uncertainty. It's hard to imagine a life outside of this, outside of the responsibility. I get it, Jack said. I do. But maybe the next step for both of us is about learning to live with the changes. We can't undo what happened, but maybe we can make something new from it. She met his eyes, her gaze steady and sincere. You're right. I can't ignore what happened, but I can choose how to move forward. We both can. Jack smiled, relieved that they were on the same page. It was a small step, but it felt important. For the first time since he arrived on the Calderon world, he felt like he wasn't just an outsider. He was part of something that was now evolving and changing, just like he was. I don't know what the future holds for us, Jack said, but I'm willing to find out. Together. Elira's smile widened, and for the first time in what felt like a long while, she allowed herself to feel hope. The future was still uncertain, but it didn't have to be faced alone. With Jack by her side, she felt ready to step into the unknown. As the two of them stood together, watching the sunset over the desert landscape, they both knew that their journey was just beginning. The bond they had formed was not just about duty or prophecy. It was about understanding, trust, and the shared desire to create something new. The world had changed, and so had they. And together, they would find their way forward, no matter what challenges awaited them. The days had turned into weeks, and the uncertainty that had once clouded Jack's mind began to clear. He was no longer just a stranger in an alien world. He was part of something greater, a partnership, a bond that had been formed under impossible circumstances. Yet every day brought new challenges and questions. What did the future hold? And more importantly, how would they face it together? The Calderon people had begun to accept him, not just as a savior, but as an ally. Jack had proven himself to them, not by being a warrior or a diplomat, but by being someone they could trust. He had helped the queen, and in return, they had begun to see him as one of their own. Elira, however, had found herself at a crossroads. As queen, her duties were endless, but for the first time in her life, she felt a desire to carve her own path, a path that didn't just rely on tradition or duty. She wanted to live, to experience things beyond the responsibilities of her throne. And for the first time in years, she felt ready to explore those possibilities, together with Jack. One evening, as the stars filled the sky and the desert winds whispered through the palace, Elira and Jack stood together on a balcony, overlooking the vast landscape below. The Calderon world was beautiful, with its rolling dunes and shimmering light. But now it felt different to Elira. It wasn't just her home. It was the place where she had found something more, a future with someone who saw her as more than a queen. I never imagined my life would be like this, Elira said softly, her eyes on the horizon. I always thought I was meant to carry the weight of my people, alone. But I don't feel alone anymore. Jack turned toward her, a small smile playing on his lips. You never were alone, he replied. You just didn't know it. Elira met his gaze, her heart full. She had spent so many years carrying the burdens of her people's survival, the weight of leadership pressing down on her, but now she had someone by her side. Someone who was willing to share the responsibility, someone who cared not just for her title, but for her as a person. What will happen now? Elira asked, the uncertainty creeping back into her voice. Now that we've done what needed to be done, what comes next for us? Jack paused, his fingers brushing against hers. He had thought about this a lot. He had seen the struggles Elira had faced as queen, and as a woman who carried the weight of an entire species on her shoulders. But now he saw the chance for something new, a future where they could both be free to define their own paths. "I don't know exactly," he said slowly, "but I do know one thing. We'll face it together. Whatever comes, we'll take it one step at a time." Elira smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I don't need anything more than that." Together, they stood in silence, watching the stars twinkle in the sky above. The Calderan people had found hope in their queen's actions, and Jack had found a place where he truly belonged. The challenges of the past were not forgotten, but they no longer defined their future. What mattered now was that they had a choice, a chance to build a life, not just for the Calderans, but for themselves. Jack and Elira had faced the impossible, and now, together, they would shape the future. The bond they had formed, the trust they had built, was stronger than any force they had encountered before, and with each passing day, their connection deepened, not just as queen and protector, but as two people who had come together against all odds. And as the night wore on, Jack knew one thing for certain. No matter what challenges they faced, they would face them together. They had already begun the most important journey of all, building a future where love, trust, and shared dreams would light their way.